But it's when I was looking at a few episodes then during the week, just to kind of get a feel for it again, and with a certain amount of historical distance, you can see that, like a lot of series of its vintage, you know, the X-Files and later Star Trek comes to time, there's a hostility to the institutions of the state that is not necessarily that progressive, okay? But it also epitomizes a sort of Clinton-era dissident liberalism. Within Buffy especially, there is a sense that we're all liberals, but, you know, we actually want, you know, we would like to go a bit further. So Buffy is quite famous and celebrated for its treatment of gay relationships. It's quite it's quite renowned for its critique of, you know, patriarchal institutions and so forth. And at times it did veer on more, I suppose, that's not Marxist obviously, but storylines and narratives that would be more openly amenable to, I suppose, the likes of us, okay, in confrontations with particular forms of power and corruption and so forth. So it's also a rebuke, if we actually jump back a little bit to the 1970s, it's also an explicit rebuke to the types of superheroes we had in the 70s. The Bionic Man, the Bionic Woman, these people who were actually constructed by the state, literally, to fight for the state, who work explicitly for the state. Buffy was a maverick, and in a kind of problematical way, you know, calling on the powers of the supernatural to aid her in various quests and so forth. But what's actually important about Buffy is, in a strange way, is that there is a nod to some form of collectivism in it. It throws out this idea of the lone superhero with a secret identity, because this disappears very quickly. So you have a kind of widening circle of friends who become involved more and more and more. And at the end of the third season, we actually do have, you know, something of a pop cultural mass insurrection, which is, you know, still quite impressive to watch, as a corrupt politician literally turns into a snake. So you can't fault them on, you know, so you can't fault them on that kind of imagery. But let's actually, I'm going to take something people don't really do. I'm going to actually look at the class, you know, the treatment of class in Buffy, which is actually less than progressive. We have one explicitly working class character called Xander, and he's coded as working class in a number of ways. He's completely marginalized within the storylines, to the extent that in one episode they basically do a story about how marginalized he is. You know, his parents drink and fight. His mother's idea of cooking is calling the Chinese takeaway. He's not smart enough to go to college, so he ends up in a succession of, you know, dead-end manual jobs before becoming a carpenter. But lo and behold, in great narratives of social mobility, he's so good with his hands that he quickly becomes a supervisor and is driving a big car. So, you know, he's, you know, nicely assimilated back into the group at that point. The second, I suppose, prominent character that we could code and define as working class is Faith, who is a slayer who comes along in the third series, who is from Rust Belt, East Coast America. Her mother was an alcoholic. And when she gets to power, again, working class people can't trust them. She kind of goes loopy and evil, and, you know, doesn't know he's not able to control it. Unlike Buffy, who's nice and middle class, and he was nicely brought up, and, you know, is able to keep these kind of impulses under control. And whenever, you know, Xander and Faith get together, they tend to get things wrong. They read the situation all wrong. They're hot-headed. They go off half-cocked, and it's up to the more rational elements of the group, shall we say, to sort things out. But, you know, and a lot of evil in Sunnydale, which is the town it's set in, also seems to emanate from the wrong side of the tracks as well. You will see, you know, demon dogs and whatever being released from these rundown homes, you know, obviously coded as white trash and whatever. But I leave that aside, because the most commented on aspect of Buffy is its engagement with patriarchal authority. Okay? Now, it's engaging directly and antagonistically with historical representations of women in fantasy, horror, and the vampire genre, which at best are often sexist and at worst, you know, openly misogynistic. So she was conceived as, it sounds weird, she was conceived as a feminist superhero, but the germ of the idea came from Joss Whedon when, you know, he got so sick of watching all these films where this little blonde girl was chased down an alleyway and killed, that he said, well, what would happen if she actually turned around and fought back? So there is this kind of counterintuitive element to the idea that you have, you know, that Sarah Michelle Gellar is this kind of outcast with a secret identity and superpowers. And again, we see this, you know, often the anti-misogyny becomes quite explicit. In season 6, the villains are a group of really sad nerds, okay? One of whom is openly misogynistic and is flayed alive, which is kind of a cool scene, but I'm not going to show it. Okay, so we go with superheroes, never challenge, never overturn the social order. True, but in terms of the social order and superhero narratives, Buffy probably comes closer than most, okay? The mythology of the Slayer is that there is one girl in all the world. It is a girl who has been given her powers in ancient times by a cabal of men, and they basically ensure that only one girl has these powers because that's fine, but give a load of women superpowers and you could have a problem. But in the final episode, her friend Willow, who's a witch, it's weird using terms like this at a conference like this, but here we go, basically subverts this line and, you know, transmits these powers to every single girl in the world who has the potential to become a Slayer. It's kind of a hokey and corny scene, but the language in the scene itself is, you know, is the language of empowerment. So these are kind of the progressive aspects. One bit that kind of gets overlooked is that, like the rest of American popular culture post 9/11, Buffy, you know, kind of wobbled. Okay, it really is. You know, it's kind of the definition of that old adage that a conservative is a liberal who got mugged. You know, it's like, oh, okay, something's gone a bit weird here. We can't deal with it. So we get the military who were treated very ambivalently previously return to Sunnydale as a kind of a special strike force, and they happily work alongside them to catch this demon, who, if it's caught by terrorists, could be dropped on a populated area, and they catch it, and that's wonderful. Season 7, most problematically, sees a person called a thing called the First Evil. And I'm going to show you a clip of Buffy's speech in that context, because this is literally Buffy declaring war on terror. And, you know, it's something to behold. Hang on.
We could make plans, as we always do, but the truth is, Buffy wasn't. There is no
Gets clearer in a second.
She looks bad.
She does. I'm afraid there may be eternal bleeding.
On her knees, isn't she?
Life? I don't think so. I don't know.
Well, what if she can't beat this thing?
We're back at square one.
Which square would that be exactly?
I'm not sure. The first predates everything we've ever known. Or can know. It's everywhere, it's pure. I don't know if we can fight it.
You're right. We don't know how to fight it. We don't know when it'll come. We can't run, can't hide, can't pretend it's not the end, because it is. And something's always been there to try and destroy the world. We've beaten them back. But we're not dealing with them anymore. We're dealing with the reason they exist. Evil. The strongest. The first.
Buffy, I know you're tired.
I'm beyond tired. I'm beyond scared. I'm standing on the mouth of hell, and it is going to swallow me whole. And it'll choke on me. We're not ready. They're not ready. They think we're going to wait for the end to come, like we always do. I'm done waiting. They want an apocalypse. Well, we'll give them one. Anyone else who wants to run, do it now. Because we just became an army. We just declared war. From now on, we won't just face our worst fears. We will seek them out. We will find them and cut out their hearts one by one until the first shows itself for what it really is. And I'll kill it myself. only one thing on this earth more powerful than evil, and that's us. Any questions?
Okay, doesn't it just want to make you throw your fist in the air and go, USA, USA? Okay, so that I suppose we can call that kind of the nadir of the whole thing, you know, the low point. But there are the kind of good contradictory moments in it. Okay, hopefully, if it's visible, the iconography in that picture won't need too much explanation to many of the people in this room. Okay, this is from a season 3 episode where Buffy discovers effectively a Victorian steel mill below Los Angeles, a hellish version, obviously, you know, and leads all the slaves to safety. And you know, we get this completely unintentional, apparently, according to Joss Whedon, the creator, but you know, no less. Sorry,
what is that? I can't see it.
It's a hammer and sickle.
Oh,
She's holding a hammer and a sickle-shaped axe. And, you know, this image and this sequence itself has kind of been subject of a lot of kind of, you know, critical attention, most particularly an essay called Vampire Dialectics, of all things. But again, you know, these are, you know, good pop cultural moments which become iconic, but it doesn't kind of move away from the fact that, you know, Buffy, you know, largely progressive and liberal with these moments, but, you know, nothing really there to hang coherent, you know, to hang a coherent critique on. So we'll move and kind of go on to somebody who everyone is familiar with in some shape or form at this point. Our good friend V, who we see all over the place at every single demo and every single protest, kind of annoying me. But anyway. Now I'm going to kind of do a kind of a quick comparison between, you know, V the comic book. Anybody read the comic book? Okay. Anybody seen the film? See, people don't read enough books. If you haven't read the comic book, read the. If you haven't, I downloaded. Read the comic book. It is actually, you know, quite an arresting and interesting piece of work. Now, context is everything with V for Vendetta. The comic book was originally conceived in 1981, 2 years into Thatcher's first term as UK Prime Minister. And it seemed to Alan Moore, the writer, that here we were at a point where not only did nuclear war seem possible, but you know, a Conservative defeat at the next election was inevitable. There would be a Labour government which would conceivably remove all the missiles from Britain, meaning that when there was a nuclear war, Britain would in some miraculous way survive. As he said at the time, yeah, my prognosticating powers are not that, you know, are not that good. But this is the context of it, and it's the context in which, you know, there is a breakdown. You know, there is a breakdown. Explicitly fascist power. You know, an explicitly fascist party comes to power, and David Lloyd, the illustrator and co-writer, you know, in the first collection, compared V for Vendetta with, you know, a lot of the other kind of comic book characters and what was out in popular culture at the time. And he's writing in the context of the 1980s in Britain with EastEnders, with these comedy shows, with game shows full of cheeky, cheery characters. And, you know, and he says, you know, V for Vendetta is for people who don't switch off the news when it comes on. But, you know, the quote there at the top from Alan Moore, I mean, it's his reaction to the film. And Alan Moore is so annoyed by adaptations of his work, he won't even accept royalties for them. Okay, that's really annoyed. I mean, I'd take them. You know, but you know, he basically reviled the film version as, you know, a Bush-era parable for people who are too timid to make a political satire in their own country because it was made in 2004. So I think he's been a little bit slightly harsh on the film, but he makes the point that the book was specifically about things like fascism and anarchy. Fascism and anarchy don't actually appear once in the film. And it's a fair enough point, and the comic itself shows a whole corpus, you know, named the year, nose of throat, to actually suggest this corporate fascist state. And its maintenance of power, you know, actually seems to rely, and this is important to, you know, Alan Moore in the comic book, you know, that basically, you know, in some way the population have gone to sleep. They are a silent, you know, they are a silent majority. And this is where V comes in. You know, he's kind of a wake-up call. he is there to kind of fiddle things around and, and provoke. He is, he's the definition of, I suppose, a good agent provocateur. So, and also, just in the current context, looking at this during the week, I mean, in that comic book, Alan Moore was actually depicting paedophilia among the British establishment. I mean, it was there, bishops and all the rest of it, and an absolute open tolerance for it. So, I won't say he was years ahead of his time, but he was, he was making plain what a lot of people suspected. But I mean, this is how V in the comic book kind of explains where he's coming from. And there are kind of quotes thrown in from Bakunin and Emma Goldman and so forth throughout the book. But, in terms of how the, anarchism is theorized, it's not particularly systemic. I mean, it is there. Basically, I will clear all the deadwood out of the way, and then it's up to you to do what you will afterwards. So the film, contrast this to the film, where the film falls back on a kind of a conspiratorial rise to power for the government, where the government had, released a toxin into the environment and blamed it on, presumably Muslim terrorists. And whereas in the film, the climactic scene involves the army, basically laying down its weapons and allowing the crowd to flow over them. In the comic book, basically there is an open confrontation, and they are, the troops are decimated by, the force of the mass. But I mean, the difference here is that, as far as, from Alan Moore's perspective and from V's perspective, I suppose, is that the masses are to be trusted with power, okay? That we will leave it up to you to build whatever world you wish to build afterward. If you wish to descend back into slavery, that is up to you, but here is a choice. So, what's interesting, I suppose moving beyond the film itself, and I have a clip at V at the end, so don't be worried. What's interesting is that, the effective V, I mean, whatever the faults within the narrative, both filmically and, and in terms of the book, is that the point is that people are not meant to actually become V, okay? The idea is that people then step out into the open and act collectively and take power. It was not meant that everyone, literally runs around wearing V masks, okay? It seems to have, well, not everyone, obviously, but, this is what has been taken from it, is kind of the visual imagery, which is ironic given that, much of the narrative itself is concerned in a negative way with the power of visual imagery and of the icons of the state and so forth to actually enforce compliance and obedience. But more still, I mean, he's got a bit wacky of late. I mean, he's become a spiritualist and a guru and all this kind of thing. But he still self-consciously identifies as an anarchist. And he intervened last year during the Occupy movement, when Frank Miller, who comic book fans will know, basically denounced the Occupy movement as louts, thieves and rapists, an unruly mob fed by Woodstock-era nostalgia and putrid false righteousness. So I don't think he liked them very much. But anyway, Moore responded to this, by saying outright that, the Occupy was a completely justified howl of moral outrage, that it had been handled in a very intelligent, non-violent way, which is probably one reason why Frank Miller didn't like it. And said if it had been a bunch of young sociopathic vigilantes with Batman makeup on their faces, Miller would have been more in favour of it. And then goes on to denounce him, which quite wonderfully, for, that is, the Sin City comic books were unreconstructed misogyny. 300, which was made into a film, appeared to be wildly ahistoric, homophobic. To add to that, we could probably add racist and completely misguided. And, he says, I have detected this kind of nasty streak in Miller's work for a long time. Now, Miller is important because he is a kind of a direct link from that end of it into the Batman thing, okay? Batman was reinvented in the 1980s away from kind of the campiness of what we might call, the 1960s version, which is, this one, which we're all familiar with, into a more kind of gritty, supposedly gritty realist, which in essence depicted a dark, threatening urban scape descending into entropy and chaos, and the narratives were actually quite misanthropic as well. So we go from that to, in the latest series of, through all the various permutations of the Batmobile into something which is, explicitly an ugly, military vehicle for use in the city. You know, I've kind of left out all of the permutations it took in the Tim Burton and Joel Schumacher films, but that is the kind of journey we're on about, okay? In the 1960s, we have this kind of playful Batman, you know, very camp, very silly, because there seems something ridiculous, even at that point, of the idea of, you know, a superhero being at the beck and call of the mayor of Gotham City in the way that he was. There was a playfulness with the institutions of power within popular culture. We get to 2005, 2006, and that really disappears completely from the Nolan movies. In the name of supposed realism and grittiness, we get, not only do we not get a Batman, you know, basically at the beck and call of the mayor of Gotham City, we get one who is explicitly putting himself outside of, you know, the established social order, and not in a good way, if we might say that. So Batman is an exemplar of how, you know, superheroes change to fit the times. Batman Begins, if anyone remembers it, it actually ends with Bruce Wayne, you know, buying up all of the kind of publicly available stock in his father's companies and amassing it all to himself. You know, not quite privatization, but the signal is there that, you know, vast amounts of wealth in the hands of the right people can be used, you know, in the right way, once it's privately held, of course. And this is kind of the starting point for the latter two films. Now, The Dark Knight Rises, the last one, received an awful lot of attention for being supposedly reactionary and so forth. Personally, I think the second one is worst and kind of more openly, disturbingly fascistic. Because with The Dark Knight, you actually have to kind of look below the surface narrative and actually see how the film is being framed to you and presented to you to kind of see what's going on. So the audience are offered a choice, and I'm just going to show this clip very quickly. I can sacrifice the one at the end if I have to, but I'm going to show this one, as it is kind of important.
3 weeks in your reservation here. And I had to tell him I work for the government.
Really?
The city health inspector's not afraid to pull strings.
Rachel. Fancy that.
Yeah, Bruce. Fancy that.
Rachel, Natasha, Natasha, Rachel.
Natasha, are you the
Renowned ballerina for the Moscow Ballet.
Wow. Harvey's taking me next week.
Really? So, you're in the ballet?
Bruce, this is Harvey Dent.
The famous Bruce Wayne. Rachel's told me everything about you.
I certainly hope not. So, let's put a couple tables together.
I'm not sure that they'll let us.
Oh, they should. I own the place.
How could you raise children in a city like this?
Well, I was raised here. It turned out okay.
Is Wayne Manor in the city limits?
The Palisades? Sure. You know, it was our new DA. You might want to figure out where your jurisdiction ends.
I'm talking about the kind of city that idolizes a masked vigilante.
Gotham City is proud of an ordinary citizen standing up for what's right.
Gotham needs heroes like you, elected officials, not a man who thinks he's above the law.
Exactly. Who appointed that?
We did. All of us who stood by and let scum take control of our city.
But this is a democracy, Harvey.
When their enemies were at the gates, the Romans would suspend democracy and appoint one man to protect the city. It wasn't considered an honor, it was considered a public service.
Harvey, the last man that they appointed to protect the Republic was named Caesar, and he never gave up his power.
Okay, fine. You either die a hero, or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain. Look, whoever the Batman is, he doesn't want to do this for the rest of his life. How could he? Batman is looking for someone to take up his mantle.
Someone like you, Mr. Dent?
Maybe. If I'm up to it.
What if Harvey Dent is the Caped Crusader?
If I were sneaking out everything, someone would have noticed by now.
Well, I'm sold. Yeah. I'm going to throw you a fundraiser.
That's nice of you, Bruce, but I'm not up for re-election for 3 years.
No, you don't understand. One fundraiser with my pals. You'll never need another cent.
That's a bit louder, all right? Okay. So you're being, you know, you're kind of, narratively you're being given two choices here. You can have masked vigilante man, or you can have good liberal politician man. Of course, being Batman, the good liberal politician bit doesn't work out at all, as we kind of know, and he ends up being disfigured and turning evil and all the rest of it, at which point you are basically left with chaos, or the man he wants. I mean, Batman, I mean, what's worse, the worst thing about The Dark Knight is that it's such a thinly veiled allegory for the war on terror. We have the Joker who's just in love with chaos. He just wants to break things up. We have Batman, you know, blithely violating international law. He goes to China to kidnap this criminal because the Chinese will never extradite one of their own. So Batman has to go in and do it, and they can't trust the government to do it. And there's actually there's a real trend sense of the whole yellow peril thing in The Dark Knight. Actually, you know, the takeover of Wayne Industries by the Chinese. When Bruce Dent is threatened in court by a mobster with a Chinese-made gun, which he derides, you know, dismissively because it's not American. And organised crime in all the Batman films is framed in a particular way. Yet we have criminals trying to adopt, you know, kind of, you know, the structures and language of capitalism. So we have criminals trying to be capitalists, but we never actually get the contrary, which is, you know, basically a capitalist criminal class. And because Wayne is not a proper capitalist. He's a nice one, you know. He didn't actually earn any of that money. He's a trust fund kid, which is kind of made fun of. But it also keeps his hands away from all the nasty stuff, like, you know, as Richard Seymour put it, you know, it keeps me from all the labour disputes and environmental code regulations and outsourcing and all those kind of dynamics. And he takes the money and he uses it to protect people. You know, he's building better weapons to better protect the populace. Now, Mark Fisher points out that The Dark Knight, who's an English cultural theorist, Mark Fisher points out that The Dark Knight exposes the duplicity and fictions necessary for the social order to maintain itself. Okay, that we see this in The Dark Knight, especially where Batman kind of takes onto himself the mantle of villain just so the city can survive intact with its illusions about Harvey Dent intact. But the way it does it, I think, is that it invites the audience to accept and in a way to become complicit in those decisions itself by not actually providing any space within the narrative for alternatives or for alternative interpretations. So the weird thing about Batman is that it's not that in the films the masses are actually absent. It's that they're always there, but they're always cowed and terrified and herded together in big places to do the will, to do the will of whichever evil super body tends to be on the loose. So The Dark Knight Rises takes some relish in seeming to attack the wealthy. We have Selina Kyle, who later, you know, Catwoman, you know, who says this at the beginning of the film, that there's a storm coming, that, you know, you're going to pay for living so large for so long, and people kind of jumped on this as an anti-capitalist message. Well, you know, I've news for you. Anti-capitalism is fine with Hollywood. They don't care. You can slag off capitalism all you like. J.R. Ewing, he's an evil git. You know, Wally, that was all fine. You can slag capitalism, you can critique it, you can even critique whole corporations. But the one thing that you can never do, really, within the bounds of Hollywood and popular cultural narratives, or at least you can do them, but you won't kind of get mass appeal from them, is that you can't actually question the idea of property itself. You can't actually posit a genuine overthrow of the social order without coming to a bad end, which is exactly what we get in The Dark Knight Rises. So, who's seen The Dark Knight Rises? Okay, that's enough. Okay, that's enough people that have seen it. Please, nobody else go and watch it. But basically, what we have is, you know, your archetypal conservative, supposedly conservative nightmare of what would happen if the masses took power, and it's crap. You know, it's nonsense. And we have this scene here of, you know, supposedly echoing, you know, the women knitting under the guillotine at the French Revolution, summary executions, rich people being made to walk the ice, which was kind of cool. But you know, it's this idea that, you know, the world would collapse into chaos. And even Selina Kyle, our erstwhile heroine here, at the end is kind of, well, you know, maybe they're not so bad after all, and we do kind of need them. And it's a real, you know, post-2008, it's a real plea for some kind of return to the status quo, that we will behave ourselves, we will look after you better the next time, we won't have the same kind of excesses. And this is where I tortuously bring it right back to the beginning, because I'm just finished now, John. There's a quote from Thomas Andre from the essay that he actually wrote on Superman during the 1930s, that in most of these superhero narratives, the destructive individualism of the entrepreneur is projected onto the masses, whose potential impulses are always stigmatized as deriving from the same causes as the nation's ills. We all partied, okay? We all know this. You know, stop being greedy, we have no money, that kind of thing. The warning at the end of a story like the first Superman story, and undoubtedly at the end of Batman, is that people should not dream in their bitterness and disappointment of tampering with the failing institutional apparatus for fear of courting a greater catastrophe. And this is usually, you know, this is usually the moral at the end of these things, that however bad it is, what will happen will, you know, what comes next will be worse if you actually tamper with things in any systemic way. So, with that in mind, and I'm going to kind of take a slightly different, end on a slightly different note, but with that in mind and thinking I've kind of cheated you out of with 2 clips of people talking, I'm going to literally end now, John, I'm finished, with the final clip from V for Vendetta. And it's problematic in some ways, undoubtedly, but it's problematic in some ways, but at the same time, we do actually see Alan Moore, you know, in some form, Alan Moore's different conception of, you know, the power of the masses is different, you know, his idea of the, you know, of the overturning of the social order and so forth. But mostly because, you know, it's kind of spectacular, and in a talk on superheroes, you deserve a bit of spectacle. So this is it.
Stop right there. You're Evie Hammond, aren't you? And it's over.
Almost.
Stop. Get your hand off that lever.
Enemy is approaching fast. Requesting orders. General, what should we do?
There's no response from command. Or from Party Leader Creedy. Or from the High Chancellor.
Why are you doing this?
Because he was right.
About what?
That this country needs more than a building right now. It needs hope. Tell me, do you like music, Mr. Finch?
That music.
Yes, his music.
Was it?
Who's Edmund Dantes?
And he was my father, and my mother, my brother, my friend. He was you. And me. He was all of us. No one will ever forget that night, and what it meant for this.
Stephen Fry gets in everywhere. Okay, I'm aware that there are probably a bigger number of nerds on the left as there is everywhere else, so I'm prepared to be upbraided for egregious omissions and all the rest of it, but thanks for listening anyway.
Okay, thanks very much for that, Séamus. Okay, we'll open it up straight away, folks, for anyone who'd like to ask a question or make a comment or whatever. We have a Buffy. Anyone who is looking for accommodation for the weekend, just ask for Kriya up at the registration desk. That's one thing. And the opening rally, which is going to be taking place in 20 minutes' time, is 2 rooms up the way, and it's you know, it's going to be a great rich boy bars. We've an Egyptian comrade over, one from Greece and Spain, and an Irish comrade who's just literally back from Gaza, and of course Kitty Holland, the Irish Times journalist who broke the story, the tragic story of Savita, the young woman who died 3 weeks ago, 28th of October, in the regional hospital down in Galway. She's going to be speaking about that case, and just to say that tomorrow we've adjusted the timetable so that everyone who can and wants to can go on the Never Again. It's the march to protest the horrific state of affairs as it stands in Ireland, where Savita Halavar in the year 2012 in an Irish hospital died suffering and in pain after being denied an abortion she and her husband repeatedly requested. It's going to be a major demonstration for anyone who was at the Dáil there 2 days ago. It was very moving. I think tomorrow's could be a major event. So that's at 4 p.m. tomorrow in the at the beginning Parnell Square at the Garden of Remembrance. So I'll hand you back over to Séamus, and thank you for all your contributions.
Okay, I'll try and cram all this in within 5 minutes. Martin, your point, yeah, about the Berlin Wall. I mean, yeah, I mean, I didn't say it, but I mean the vision of the actions of the masses, if you like, in that final scene of V for Vendetta is probably closer historically to how we see power being taken than massive gun battles. Whether it was the troops not firing at the Berlin Wall or the troops in Petrograd in 1917 not firing on the crowd and acting as a catalyst. I mean, there is something far more typical about that kind of action than there is about all-out assault. Your point about the beautiful people, I think you've kind of more or less dealt with that. But what I would say is that we are talking about pop cultural products being made within commercial institutions, and there are certain compromises that are made, okay, to get them on air and keep them on air. Some of them are happy, some of them are not so happy, but there we go. Colm, yeah, I don't actually disagree with anything that you said, and I read a lot of those reviews myself, but the remit, and I was coming in, was we are actually dealing with narratives which do actually engage with the idea of different types of social change. So in that context, the position of the masses is kind of quite important. I mean, there's a long way, and I mean this respectfully, but there's a long way from the full Monty to Buffy and Superman and whatever. So we are dealing with, narratives that are in some ways attempting to, engage to deal with ideas of social change. And just, I don't want to out-nerd you, but also, in season 7 as well, when they tell Buffy to piss off, it all kind of ends really badly for them, and they have to come back to it because they go off all half-cocked. But I take the broader point that it's a very contradictory narrative. And my intention in showing that was not to kind of suggest that this was a final kind of philosophical position on behalf of Joss Whedon. The idea that, what coming in? Am I still not finished? Hang on, thanks. while they're moving. It's kind of difficult to concentrate with the noise, though. Okay, Becky, someone must have heard me. Okay. So we have this idea of, you know, I don't believe that these narratives are simply a kind of reflection of what's happening at the, you know, at higher, other levels of the social order. I think that within these narratives, all superhero narratives, there is an awful lot of symbolic resonance and reflection going on. So we have supernatural elements standing in for far more mundane and material things. So the way in which those dynamics are engaged with are actually quite important. But I do think, I mean, especially with something like Batman, somebody used the word there about something being a sop for the viewer. I mean, yeah, this is very much the type of, I don't want to get into a kind of Frankfurt School conspiratorial thing, but these are the kind of images of anti-capitalism that is acceptable. It's open to critique so long as the essential power structures aren't attacked. Now, I'm waiting here one day for this film to come up which will actually show the whole thing through to the end, and I will applaud and go and see it with the rest of you, but I can't see it actually happening anytime soon, because this happens, you know, these types of narratives and these types of, I won't call them cop-outs, but these types of resolutions are, you know, too systematic and too regular to simply be, you know, to simply be coincidence. And one final thing, because I kind of can't resist it, is to go to, you know, Vanessa, your point on Doctor Who. You're quite right about the status of, you know, the companion in the reboot version. But if we actually look at the first reboot version from 2005, when we have Christopher Eccleston and then David Tennant, when Russell T Davies was in charge, who was the writer behind Queer as Folk in the late 1990s, what we actually have is, and it's not only the fact that we have this kind of feisty, sparky female companion, but, you know, she's basically a chav, okay? She lives in a council estate. Her whole family are involved, okay? She works in a shop. It's, you know, avowedly and kind of proudly multicultural. And there is this constant refrain, really corny refrain, but a refrain nonetheless, and a kind of a sentimental one, that ordinary people matter. Okay, and we actually see that carries on from Russell T Davies into Torchwood, where if anyone see Children of Earth, which is one of the best pieces of TV science fiction ever made, I think. But effectively, at the end, when the British Army are going in abducting kids, it is basically ordinary people on a council estate in Wales who do this. When we look at Doctor Who, then when Stephen Moffat comes in, all of a sudden we're back to this idyllic village. You know, our heroine arrives dressed as a strippogram. It all becomes very homogenized again, very rural and very, you know, and very safe. Not to mention the kind of weird narrative turns with Daleks and Hitler and all the rest of it and that kind of thing. But anyway, final rally starting soon, so I'll leave it there. Thanks very much again, everyone.